In 1988, something began walking through Bishopville at night, and the worst part was not the scratches on the cars, or the torn fences, or the blood in the mud. The worst part was that it moved on two legs, and it was not in a hurry. The first time I heard it outside my house, I thought someone was testing my door, but doors rattle differently when hands touch them, and what pressed against mine had weight, patience, and claws that dragged slowly across the wood as if it wanted me to hear exactly how close it was. People say reptiles are cold-blooded, but when I looked through the blinds and saw a tall shape standing under my porch light, scaled and rigid and completely still, I understood something that has never left me since that night, because it was not wandering and it was not lost. It was checking the houses one by one. If you think this is exaggeration, then stay with me, because what hunted our town that summer was not a rumor, and it was not alone. And by the time the newspapers gave it a name, 3 of us already knew what it was capable of. Subscribe now if you want the version that was never printed, because once I tell you what it did when it realized we were watching back, you will understand why some of us still do not answer the door after dark. That was the summer. Something reptilian stood under my light, and it knew I was inside. The night it came back was not dramatic, and it was not loud in the way horror stories like to pretend these things are loud, because there were no thunderclaps and no sudden screams splitting the dark. There was only a steady, humid pressure hanging in the air over Bishopville that made breathing feel thick and slow. And sometime after midnight, when the cicadas should have been screaming in the trees and the swamp frogs should have been calling across the water, everything stopped at once, as if the entire ecosystem had been switched off by something that did not belong to it. I was awake when it happened, not because I sensed danger, but because I could not sleep properly anymore. After the first time it circled my truck, and I had started keeping the porch light on through the night, even though the bulb attracted moths that battered themselves senseless against the glass. And I remember staring at the ceiling while sweat gathered behind my neck when I heard the first step on the wooden boards outside my front door, a deliberate step that carried weight and balance in a way that no animal I had ever known could manage without scratching or scrambling for grip. The second step came slower, almost thoughtful, and then something heavy leaned against the door as if it were listening through the wood. And I felt that pressure from the other side as clearly as if someone had pressed a palm flat against my chest, because the hinges shifted slightly under strain, and the old frame gave a soft complaint that echoed through the hallway. And that was the moment I understood that whatever stood there was not trying to break in yet, because it could have shattered that door if it wanted to. It was trying to measure me. I moved toward the hallway without turning on any lights, because instinct told me that illumination would only confirm my exact position. And as I reached the door, I heard a slow dragging scrape that started high near the top panel and curved downward in 3 deliberate lines. Not the frantic gouging of claws seeking entry, but something more controlled and precise, almost like a signature being carved into the wood. And I felt anger rise in me because fear alone was too helpless to stand on its own. Before I could stop myself, I placed my hand flat against the inside of the door exactly where the pressure had been. And the moment I did, something on the other side shifted and pressed back, not violently, not jerking or striking, but pressing in equal measure as if acknowledging that it felt me there. And in that single silent exchange, I understood that this was not a blind predator reacting to movement. This was something aware enough to respond. The porch light flickered once, and in that faint interruption of brightness, I saw the shadow under the door stretch sideways instead of forward, which meant it was not crouched like an animal, but standing upright and angled slightly. And then the pressure vanished as smoothly as it had arrived, replaced by a slow retreating step that carried weight down the wooden boards and into the yard where something large displaced the grass without hurrying. When I opened the door minutes later, against every instinct telling me not to, the night had resumed its normal sounds as if nothing had happened. But carved into the surface of my door were 3 deep grooves that started higher than my own head and ended near the handle, and there were faint wet marks between them that shimmered under the porch light, like something had dragged scaled skin against the wood before stepping away. That was the night I stopped wondering if the town rumors were exaggerations, because nothing that moved like that was wandering by accident, and nothing that deliberate was done with us yet. By the following week, the town had shifted into something uneasy and half-spoken, because men who normally laughed at gossip were checking the locks on their barns twice before bed, and women who had grown up beside that swamp their entire lives were calling their children inside before sunset without offering any explanation. And yet no one wanted to be the first to admit that what was happening felt organized rather than random. I began driving the back roads at night, not because I was brave, but because I needed proof that what had pressed against my door was not something my mind had inflated. And the swamp roads around Scape Ore were narrow and uneven and swallowed headlights in a way that made every curve feel like a tunnel. And it was along one of those stretches that I first saw it in full shape rather than shadow. The beam from my truck cut across the tree line and froze on something standing just beyond the ditch, tall enough that its head brushed the lower branches and broad enough through the shoulders that it did not resemble any animal native to South Carolina, and it did not bolt when the light found it the way deer or wild hogs would. It simply turned its head slowly toward me with a controlled movement that revealed the faint shine of scaled texture along its neck. What unsettled me was not its height and not even the thickness of its arms, which hung longer than a man's would, but the way it shifted its weight onto one leg and adjusted its stance like a person who had been caught watching, because there was recognition in that posture and something disturbingly calm in the way it held eye contact through the windshield. For several seconds neither of us moved, and in that stillness I noticed that its chest expanded slightly as if breathing measured and steady, and that its hands, if that word even applies, ended in curved claws that were not flexing in agitation, but resting loosely at its sides, as though it did not consider me an immediate threat. Then it stepped forward into the full beam of the headlights, and the motion was smooth and upright and unmistakably bipedal, with knees bending forward in a way that mimicked human stride just enough to feel wrong. And as it crossed the ditch, I saw that its skin was not slimy as stories had suggested, but dry and ridged, catching light in uneven patches like cracked earth. I should have driven away immediately, but something held me there, perhaps pride, or perhaps the need to confirm that it was real. And in that hesitation it tilted its head slightly and took one more step toward the road before stopping at the edge of the asphalt, as if aware of an invisible boundary it chose not to cross. When it finally retreated, it did not crash into the trees or vanish in panic. It turned deliberately and walked back into the swamp with the same steady balance it had approached with, leaving me alone in the headlights with the realization that it had allowed me to see it. That was the moment I understood something far worse than being hunted, because predators that rely on surprise do not announce themselves in clear light, and whatever was moving through our town that summer wanted us to know it was there, long before it decided what to do next. The first time there was blood that could not be explained away as a dog fight or a drunken accident. The town responded the way small towns always respond when something threatens the story they tell themselves about being safe, which is to lower their voices, keep their eyes on the floor, and pretend that the details do not add up, because if the details add up, then you have to admit the conclusion. It happened behind the Piggly Wiggly, not in the swamp and not out on some lonely road where people could say you should not have been there, but right in town where the fluorescent lights buzzed and the dumpsters smelled like sour milk in summer heat, and the man it happened to was named Ellis Larkin, a mechanic everyone knew, because he fixed half the trucks in Bishopville, and he did it without talking much, and even people who did not like him admitted he was careful, the kind of careful that does not end up bleeding for no reason. I heard about it the next morning because my cousin worked the early shift at the diner, and she said Ellis walked in with his shirt stuck to him and his face gray and his hands shaking so badly he could not hold his coffee. And at first she thought he had been stabbed, but when she leaned close, she saw that the blood was not coming from a clean wound. It was coming from 4 deep rips across his side that looked like they had been made by something hooked and heavy that had pulled rather than sliced. And when she asked him what happened, he did not answer in words. He only kept repeating the same sentence under his breath, like a prayer he did not believe in anymore, saying it was standing on 2 legs. It was standing on 2 legs. By noon, the sheriff's office had a statement, because of course they did, and the statement said Ellis had been attacked by a wild animal, likely a large dog or an aggressive hog, and they emphasized that the community should remain calm. But the problem with lies that are told for public comfort is that they do not fit the physical world, and Ellis's wounds did not fit any animal anyone in South Carolina had ever seen, because the spacing of the rips suggested hands, not a mouth, and the height of the marks on his body suggested a creature that had grabbed him from above instead of lunging from the ground. I went to see him that evening because I could not stop myself, and his trailer smelled like antiseptic and sweat and fear, and he sat shirtless on a couch with gauze wrapped around his side, while a fan pushed hot air in circles, and when he looked at me, his eyes were glassy and furious in equal measure, like he hated himself for being scared. He told me he had stepped outside behind the store because he needed air, and because the heat had made his head swim, and he had been halfway through lighting a cigarette when he heard a sound like nails clicking on concrete, slow and measured, and when he turned, he saw a shape moving between the dumpsters with its shoulders higher than the lids. And at first, he thought it was a man playing a joke because it was upright, but then it leaned forward into the light and the skin on its arms caught the glow in hard ridges, and the face that looked back at him was not furred and not soft. It was scaled and angular with a mouth that did not move like a human mouth at all. Ellis said he froze because his brain could not decide what it was seeing, and that hesitation cost him, because it crossed the distance in 2 steps and grabbed him with a hand that felt like dry leather stretched over bone, and as it pulled him close, he smelled something sharp and mineral, like hot pennies and pond water, and then the claws raked his side as if it were not trying to kill him, but trying to open him, trying to see what was inside. When he finished, he looked at me as if daring me to deny it, and I could not, because I saw the pattern of the wounds, and I saw the terror still lodged behind his anger, and I realized that whatever was moving through Bishopville had stopped testing doors and started testing flesh, and the town could call it anything it wanted. But we both knew the truth, because you cannot bandage away the fact that something stood upright behind the grocery store and treated a grown man like an object. A lie told by someone in uniform carries a special kind of weight, not because it is convincing, but because it gives people permission to stop thinking. And when Sheriff Harlan Tate held a short press talk outside the station and told everyone that rumors were spreading faster than facts, I watched the faces in the crowd relax as if they had been offered a warm blanket, because it is easier to accept a simple animal attack than it is to admit you might be sharing a town with something that does not fit the natural order. He used the same words twice, saying there is no credible threat, saying there is no need for panic, and behind him the deputy nodded like a metronome. But what made my stomach tighten was that Tate never once said he believed Ellis. And he never once said he had checked the area behind the store himself, because he did not want to find anything that would force his hand. After the talk, I waited until the crowd thinned, and when I approached him, I kept my voice calm even though my pulse was hammering, and I told him I had seen something on the road near Scape Ore, something upright, something scaled, and for a second I saw a flicker behind his eyes that was not disbelief but recognition. And that flicker told me he had heard more than he was admitting. He leaned closer and lowered his voice and said people see things when they are scared. And then he smiled, and his smile was practiced. The kind of smile that says I am in control of this conversation. But as he spoke, I noticed something strange, because his hand kept drifting toward the pocket where his keys hung, and he kept shifting his stance as if he wanted the door behind him. And those small movements were not the movements of a man who thought this was nonsense. Those were the movements of a man who did not want to be outside for any longer than he had to. That night, Instead of going home, I drove behind the sheriff's station where the street lights were weaker and the shadows stretched longer, and I sat there with the engine off and the windows cracked, listening for anything that did not belong, because I had started to realize that whatever was happening was not random. It was moving through the town like a hand through water, touching certain places, certain people, certain boundaries, as if mapping us. Close to 2 in the morning, I saw a patrol car roll out, slow and quiet, heading toward the swamp roads, and I followed at a distance because curiosity had become a sickness in me, and the car stopped near a turnoff that led to the darker stretches of Scape Ore, and the deputy stepped out with a flashlight and a long gun, and for a moment the only sound was the engine ticking as it cooled. Then the flashlight beam swept across the ditch and caught something low in the grass, and the deputy stiffened, and I saw him raise the light higher as if tracking a shape upward, and even from where I sat I could see his shoulders tense, because he was not looking at a raccoon or a stray dog. He was looking at something tall enough that the beam had to climb. He said something I could not hear, and then, in a motion so quick it almost felt like the night itself had snapped, the light went out as if it had been struck, and the deputy stumbled backward hard enough that his hat flew off, and for 1 second the patrol car's headlights illuminated a figure at the edge of the road, upright, rigid, and impossibly still, with arms hanging too long, and a head that turned with a slow, deliberate patience. The deputy scrambled back into the car and slammed the door, and the engine roared to life, and the tires threw gravel as he reversed. And as he peeled away, I realized something that made my throat go dry, because the figure did not chase him. It did not lunge, or run, or roar. It simply watched the car retreat as if it had expected that outcome, as if fear was the point, and then it stepped backward into the grass and vanished with a calm that felt like intelligence. I drove home with my hands sweating on the wheel and my mind replaying that stillness, and I understood that the sheriff's lie was not about protecting the town from panic. It was about protecting himself from a truth he could not control, because if the law admitted what was out there, then the law would be expected to stop it. And deep down, every man who wore a badge in Bishopville knew the same thing, which was that some things do not care about your authority, and some things smile back in the dark without ever opening their mouth. By the time the 5th week of that summer arrived, Bishopville had become a place where people still went to work and still bought groceries and still waved at each other in daylight. But every normal action carried a second meaning, because every conversation ended with a pause where someone almost said what we were all thinking, and every sunset felt like a deadline that nobody had agreed on but everyone obeyed. And I began to understand that fear does not always look like screaming or running. Sometimes it looks like routine, performed with clenched teeth. It reached into the town on a Tuesday, which is the detail I remember most clearly because Tuesdays were ordinary in Bishopville, the day when nothing special happened and the week still felt long ahead. And that ordinariness is exactly why it worked, because you cannot stay in full panic forever. Your body will not hold it. And people had started to relax in small ways, leaving a window cracked, letting a teenager walk a few blocks to a friend's house, stepping onto a porch to smoke without checking the yard first. I was at the hardware store when I heard the first commotion, a sharp series of shouts followed by that sudden hush that spreads through a small crowd when something is wrong, but not yet explained. And when I pushed through the doorway, I saw a woman named Maris Caldwell, standing in the parking lot with both hands over her mouth, her eyes fixed on her station wagon, as if she could not accept what she was seeing. And as I walked closer, I saw that the rear side panel of her car had been torn open as if peeled by a giant can opener, the metal bent outward in ragged curls, the paint scored in long parallel lines that were too evenly spaced to be accident. Maris was shaking so badly her keys chimed against each other, and she kept saying she had only been inside for 10 minutes. She had parked under the lights. She had parked where everyone could see. And as she spoke, I noticed something that made my stomach turn, because the claw marks did not start low near the wheel well, the way a hog might scrape or a dog might jump. The first gouges began above the height of my shoulders and dragged down, which meant the thing that did it had stood beside her car and leaned into it with its arms raised like a man opening a door. The store owner tried to calm everyone down, and a deputy arrived and took notes while pretending to joke about vandals, but nobody laughed, because a vandal does not peel steel like fruit. And when the deputy finally crouched near the torn metal, I saw him freeze for a fraction of a second as his fingers touched something on the edge of the rip, because there was residue there that looked like dried mud, until the light hit it and revealed a faint pattern, a scaly imprint like skin pressed against fresh paint. That was the moment the crowd fractured, because some people backed away without speaking and others began talking too loudly, filling the air with theories. And I watched the deputy rise and step away from the car, as if he wanted distance, and I knew then that the swamp was no longer content with the edges of town. It had started leaving signatures where no one could deny them. That night, as if the town itself had been warned, a storm rolled in fast, heavy clouds stacking over the trees until the sky looked bruised. And when the rain came, it came hard enough to flatten the grass and turn the ditches into dark, moving water. And around 11, I heard the sound that had started all of this for me, that slow, dragging scrape against something man-made. Except this time it was not my door. It was the side of my neighbor's shed. I stood at my window and watched the yard through curtains soaked in porch light. And in the rain I saw a shape beside the shed, upright and broad-shouldered and completely wrong. And what terrified me was not the claws or the height, but the fact that it was moving with purpose, because it was not wandering the property like an animal searching for food. It was inspecting the structure, tracing the edges, dragging its hands along the boards as if it understood what walls were for and why people built them. I wanted to run outside, to shout, to do something, but the memory of Ellis's wounds held me still, and I watched as the creature leaned its head toward the shed door. And then, in a motion so controlled it felt rehearsed, it pressed its weight forward until the latch snapped and the door swung inward. And for a second the porch light revealed the shine of scaled texture along its forearm, and I saw that the fingers were not webbed and clumsy like a swamp animal's would be. They were long and jointed and capable. And then it stepped into the darkness of the shed as easily as a man stepping into his own house. The next morning, my neighbor found the shed door open, the tools scattered, and the smell inside so sharp and metallic it made him gag. And when he complained to the sheriff's office, he was told it was teenagers. But in the mud outside the shed were prints that were not paw prints and not boot prints. They were long and narrow with a heel and a forward set of toes, the impression of something that walked like us while being nothing like us. And for the first time I heard my neighbor say a sentence he had laughed at weeks earlier, because he looked at those tracks and whispered, "It is coming into town now." I used to think the worst thing about a predator was speed, the sudden rush, the teeth, the violence. But what that summer taught me is that the truly frightening thing is adaptation, because the moment something begins to learn your patterns, your habits, your small human assumptions, it stops being a beast in the woods and becomes a presence that can reach you anywhere. 2 nights after the shed, I was lying in bed with the fan humming and the rain finally gone, and I heard a sound outside that made every hair on my arms lift, because it was not a scrape and it was not a step. It was my name, spoken softly, almost politely, from somewhere near the porch, and it was spoken in a voice that did not fit the shape I had seen in the rain. At first my mind tried to rationalize, because the brain always reaches for the simplest explanation to avoid the weight of the real one. So I told myself it was a neighbor, maybe someone needing help, maybe someone drunk, and I swung my legs out of bed and walked toward the window. And as I approached, I heard it again, my name, followed by a pause, and then another word that made my stomach drop, because it was the exact phrase my mother used to call me when I was a child, and she wanted me to come to the door. The porch light was on, and in that yellow circle the yard looked empty, but the air felt charged, as if the darkness beyond the light was crowded with something unseen, and I pressed my face close to the glass and stared until my eyes watered. And then I saw movement at the very edge of illumination, not a full body stepping forward, but a subtle shift, like a shoulder withdrawing, like something choosing not to be seen clearly yet. When it spoke again, the voice was wrong in a way I cannot describe without you hearing it, because it had the shape of human speech but not the warmth, like words assembled by something that did not understand what they meant. And it repeated that childhood phrase again, slower this time. And as it did, I realized the terrifying possibility, which was that it had been close enough to homes, close enough to windows, to listen to how families spoke to each other, and now it was using those sounds like a lure. I backed away from the window so quickly, my heel caught the rug and I nearly fell, and I grabbed the baseball bat I kept beside the bed, not because I believed it could save me, but because holding nothing felt like surrender. And I stood in the hallway listening as the voice drifted along the porch, repeating my name once more, then stopping. And then I heard something else that made my mouth go dry, because I heard the slow, careful click of my porch steps as if something was shifting its weight, testing the boards, deciding whether I had moved closer or farther away. For a long minute, the only sound was my own breathing and the distant hum of insects returning. And then the voice changed, dropping the imitation and becoming silent. And that silence was worse, because silence meant it did not need to lure anymore. It meant it had learned something from my reaction. And when I finally dared to look again, I saw 3 new scratches on the porch post, high up near the top where only something tall could reach, fresh enough that the wood fibers still curled outward. The next day, I drove to Ellis's trailer and told him what I heard. And I expected him to call me crazy, but he did not, because his face went pale, and he nodded slowly, as if confirming a fear he had been trying to ignore. And he told me that when it grabbed him behind the store, he heard something like a wet clicking sound in its throat, a sound that reminded him of someone trying to form words around a mouth built for something else. And he said he believed it was not just hunting bodies, it was hunting reactions, studying what made us come closer, what made us freeze, what made us run. That was the night I stopped thinking of it as a creature of the swamp, because swamps do not whisper your name, and animals do not borrow the voice of your mother. And when I lay in bed afterward, staring into the dark, I understood that whatever was walking through Bishopville had moved past simple violence, because now it was learning to wear our language like a mask. There comes a point in every town under pressure when fear curdles into anger. And anger convinces men that if they gather enough flashlights and enough rifles and enough shared bravado, they can force the unknown back into whatever hole it crawled out of. And that point arrived in Bishopville 3 days after the voice on my porch, when Ellis stood up in the middle of the diner and said he was done waiting for something scaled and upright to decide which door to test next. It was not an organized plan in the way the movies like to pretend hunts are organized. There was no strategy board and no careful mapping of terrain. There were just 6 of us with trucks and guns, and the stubborn belief that whatever bled could be stopped. And we told ourselves that the swamp was ours because we had fished it and hunted it and grown up breathing its humidity, and that ownership would count for something once the sun dropped below the trees. We met near the turnoff to Scape Ore just after dark, engines idling low, headlights cutting through mist that clung to the ground like breath that refused to rise. And as we stepped out, I felt the shift in the air again, that subtle quiet that had become the signature of its presence. Because the frogs that usually filled the night with noise had gone silent, as if the swamp itself was holding still. Ellis moved first, pushing into the tree line with a flashlight in one hand and a shotgun in the other, and the rest of us followed in a loose formation that fell apart almost immediately once the brush thickened, because the swamp does not care about your formation, and it swallows light the way deep water swallows sound. And within minutes, the only thing I could see clearly was the narrow cone in front of me, and the backs of the men closest to me moving like shadows between trunks. We had not gone far when we found the first sign that this was a mistake, because in a patch of soft ground near the water, there were impressions that did not belong to any animal native to this state. long, narrow prints with a defined heel and forward toes that sank deeper than a human boot would have at that wake, and beside them were drag marks, as if something heavy had rested its hands on the ground while shifting position. Ellis crouched and touched one of the prints, and when he looked up his jaw tightened, because the stride between them was longer than any of ours, and before anyone could say what we were all thinking, a sound moved through the trees behind us. Not a roar and not a crash, but a slow, deliberate step that did not attempt to hide. We spun with lights raised and guns lifted, and for a fraction of a second the beams caught a shape between the trunks, tall and rigid and watching, and in that frozen moment I saw something I had not seen before, because there were two sets of eyes reflecting back at us from slightly different heights, and the realization hit like a physical blow, because we had not come into this swamp to face one predator, we had walked into the territory of more than one. The lights flickered as hands shook and someone cursed under his breath, and then the shapes moved with a speed that defied their stillness, not charging us directly but circling, staying just beyond the brightest part of our beams, forcing us to turn in tight, anxious arcs. And I heard Ellis fire once into the dark and the blast echoed violently, but there was no scream of pain, only a sudden synchronized movement in the brush that felt coordinated rather than chaotic. One of the men stumbled and went down hard, his flashlight spinning away and casting wild rotating shadows that made the trees look alive, and as I lunged to grab him, I saw something pass between us and the deeper dark, not attacking, not striking, just repositioning. And I understood with cold clarity that we were not the hunters in that moment. We were being studied as a group, measured in how we reacted to fear together. When we finally retreated, not in triumph but in fractured silence, engines roaring louder than necessary as if noise could restore control, I realized that we had shown them something important, because predators that rely on instinct scatter under gunfire. But whatever stood in that swamp had adjusted, had flanked, had observed our formation and broken it without ever committing fully to attack, and that kind of restraint is not wild, it is strategic. After the failed hunt, the town grew quieter in a way that felt permanent, because once you understand that something intelligent is moving through your woods, you stop pretending it will lose interest, and the lights in Bishopville began staying on later. Dogs were kept indoors, even in the heat, and conversations were shortened as if speaking too long might draw attention. It happened on a Sunday evening when the sky was clear and falsely peaceful, the kind of calm that makes you question whether you imagined the weeks before. And the one it chose was not reckless and not loud. It was Caleb Norris, 19 years old, home from his first semester away at college, and restless in a way only young men can be when they think danger is a story older people exaggerate. Caleb had laughed at the diner when we spoke about the swamp and said if something was out there, he wanted to see it for himself, and that arrogance feels cruel in hindsight because none of us stopped him when he said he was going for a late walk along the edge of town, where the asphalt thinned into dirt. His mother told us later that she heard him leave and assumed he would be back before midnight, and for a while nothing seemed wrong. But around 11 the power flickered once across 3 houses on that road, not a full outage but a stutter that felt intentional, and in that brief dimming several neighbors reported seeing movement near the tree line, tall silhouettes that did not blend with the shape of the woods. I was awake when the scream tore through the night, and it was not long and theatrical the way you expect in nightmares. It was short and cut off mid-breath, and the abruptness of it was worse than any drawn-out cry because it suggested something decisive. I grabbed my keys before I was fully aware of moving and drove toward the sound along with 2 other trucks that appeared as if summoned, and when we reached the stretch of dirt road where the asphalt ended, we found Caleb's flashlight lying on its side in the dust, still on, casting a weak beam across the ground where the dirt had been disturbed in violent arcs. There were no paw prints and no tire tracks and no obvious trail of blood leading away, which might have allowed denial to survive. But there were marks pressed deep into the soil on either side of the road, long, narrow impressions with defined heels that indicated something had stepped out from the trees. and then back again. In between those sets of prints were drag marks that began where Caleb's flashlight lay and disappeared into the undergrowth. We followed as far as we could before the brush thickened and the ground turned wet and uneven. And in that place, the air carried the same metallic scent Ellis had described, sharp and unnatural. And I felt the weight of being watched from more than one direction, even though I could not see a single clear shape. Someone whispered his name, and the sound seemed swallowed immediately. And in the silence that followed, I heard something move deeper in the swamp, not rushing, not fleeing, but shifting position with a patience that made it clear there was no panic on the other side of that darkness. Caleb was never found, not fully, not in a way that allows closure, and the official report listed him as missing under unclear circumstances. But everyone who stood on that road that night knew the truth without speaking it, because the ground had recorded the story clearly, and the stride of those prints was too long and too steady to belong to anything that crawled or slithered. That was the night the town stopped debating what it was and started asking how many there were. Because when something intelligent escalates from scratches to imitation to coordinated movement, and then to taking someone cleanly without chaos, it is no longer testing, it is advancing. And I lay awake until dawn with one realization settling into me heavier than any fear before it, which was that whatever had learned our doors and our voices had now learned how to remove one of us without leaving enough behind to prove it. And if it could do that once, it could do it again. After Caleb disappeared, the town did not erupt the way you might expect, because explosions of grief require certainty, and what we had was absence, and absence spreads differently. It seeps into kitchens and patrol cars and church pews and settles there like humidity, making every breath heavier without offering a target to strike. The sheriff expanded the search in a way that looked thorough from a distance. Deputies walking grids, volunteers combing the edges of the swamp, dogs brought in from 2 counties over. But I watched closely, and I noticed something that bothered me more than the official language ever could, because the search always seemed to stop just short of certain stretches of Scape Ore, where the trees grew denser and the ground dipped lower, as if there were lines on an invisible map that we were not meant to cross. It was Ellis who first said the word pattern out loud, not an accusation but an exhausted frustration, because when we laid out the incidents in order, the scratched vehicles, the shed, the imitation of voices, the coordinated circling in the swamp, and now Caleb's disappearance, they did not form random dots. They formed a curve that moved steadily closer to the center of town, like something pushing the boundaries inward. We went back to the dirt road in daylight when the sun was high and brave, and what we found there would have meant nothing to someone who had not been paying attention. But to us, it was confirmation, because along the tree line we saw more than one set of those long, narrow impressions pressed into hardened ground that had dried since the rain, and the spacing between them suggested different heights, different weights, different individuals. That was the moment the idea shifted from a creature to a presence, because one predator can stalk, but multiple predators can strategize. And as we followed the impressions along the edge of the trees, we realized they had not rushed in and out during Caleb's disappearance. They had positioned themselves at angles, one closer to the road, one deeper in the brush, and possibly one farther back, where we had never looked, creating a corridor that funneled him exactly where they wanted him. I felt a cold steadiness settle into me as that understanding took shape, because chaos can be fought and chance can be survived, but intention is harder to outmaneuver, and the more we spoke quietly about it, the more obvious it became that the escalation was not emotional or reactive, it was measured, each event revealing a new capability as if they were building a study of us piece by piece. Later that evening, I drove past the sheriff's station and saw 2 patrol cars parked closer together than usual. Lights off but engines running, and I caught a glimpse of Sheriff Tate standing outside with a state official I did not recognize, and the way they were speaking, low and urgent, told me this had moved beyond local embarrassment and into something else, something that required containment rather than denial. When Tate saw me watching, he straightened and forced that same practiced smile. But this time, it did not reach his eyes at all. And for the first time, I sensed not only fear in him, but something close to resignation, as if he understood that control had already slipped beyond the boundaries of paperwork and public statements. That night, I did not hear scratching or whispers, and the quiet was wrong in a new way, because it felt like anticipation rather than absence. And as I sat on my porch with the light blazing and the bat across my lap, I realized the pattern was not simply about proximity. It was about conditioning, because each step had tested how we responded, how we organized, how we panicked. And now that Caleb was gone, the town's rhythm had changed completely, which meant the experiment, if that is what it was, had reached a new phase. I do not know what conclusion they drew from us that summer, but I know this, because in the days that followed, the sightings did not increase, and they did not decrease. They stabilized. And that kind of balance does not come from a creature acting on hunger alone. It comes from something that has learned the boundaries it can push without forcing an all-out war. The final encounter did not happen in the swamp, and it did not happen on a back road. It happened directly under my porch light again, as if the entire summer had been bending toward that circle of yellow illumination from the beginning. And by then, I was no longer shocked by the presence, only sharpened by it. It was just past midnight when I heard the steps on the boards, not hurried and not concealed, and when I walked to the window, I did not hesitate, because part of me had grown tired of flinching at shadows, and what stood beneath the light was clearer than ever before. Tall and ridged and balanced on two legs, with arms hanging long and relaxed, the skin along its shoulders reflecting dull gold where the bulb struck it. For several seconds, we simply faced each other through glass, and I expected another imitation of my voice or my mother's phrase. But it did not speak this time, because it did not need to. And in the stillness, I noticed something that changed the way I understood everything that had happened, because its head tilted slightly, not in confusion but in assessment, as if confirming that I had adjusted too, that I was no longer reacting the way I had at the beginning. Then it did something that has stayed with me more than any scratch or scream, because it lifted one hand slowly and placed its claws flat against the porch post where the earlier marks had been carved, and it traced them lightly as if acknowledging its own work, and that gesture felt less like threat and more like documentation, like a researcher revisiting a test site. Behind it, just beyond the strongest edge of the light, I saw movement again, not fully revealed but enough to confirm the suspicion that had haunted us since the hunt, because there were shapes standing farther back in the dark, positioned at measured distances, watching not the house but the interaction between me and the one under the light. I opened the door halfway, not stepping outside but removing the barrier enough to let the humid night air in, and my heart was beating hard enough to make my vision pulse. And for a brief, impossible second, I considered speaking, not out of courage, but out of some warped desire to interrupt the pattern, to prove that I was not just a subject in whatever study had been unfolding. It leaned forward slightly, and the muscles along its arms shifted with quiet strength, and in its eyes there was no rage and no frenzy, only a depth that suggested memory. And I understood that if it chose to cross that threshold, there was nothing in my hands or in this town that could stop it, because we had already seen how easily it bypassed force when it wanted to. Instead, it lowered its hand and stepped back, slow and controlled, and as it did, the shapes behind it shifted in unison, retreating with the same coordinated rhythm I had witnessed in the swamp. And within seconds, they were absorbed by darkness that felt thicker than ordinary night. The frogs resumed first, hesitant and scattered, and then the insects followed, and the porch light hummed softly as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. But I stood there long after they vanished, because I finally understood what that summer had been about. And it was not territory, and it was not hunger, and it was not random violence. It was observation. In 1988, a small town in South Carolina believed it was being hunted by a lizard man. But the truth that settled into my bones as I stared into the trees was far worse, because predators hunt to consume, And what stood under my porch light that final night had been measuring us, mapping our reactions, testing our thresholds, and once it gathered what it needed, it simply stopped escalating. Caleb never came home, and the official story never changed, and the scratches on my porch post are still there if you know where to look, high enough that I cannot reach them without standing on a chair. And sometimes when the air is heavy and the frogs go silent all at once, I wonder whether the experiment ended that year, or whether it just moved on to another town that still believes it owns the night. If you have stayed with me this far, then you understand that some stories are not about monsters appearing. They are about monsters deciding when to withdraw. And if you want to hear the stories that never made it into any official report, subscribe and stay close, because what happened in Bishopville was not the first time something upright walked out of the swamp, and I have a feeling it was not the last.